Oh, in the choir sang this morning.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. It was, oops.
Oh, hi.
Oh, it's not 2:30 yet.
Oh, all right.
I was watching the watch.
Look, the clock. Oh, every clock is different. It's just absolutely amazing to me. Mine says 2:30. You know what? I'm going to start because I am a rebel. Okay. Thank you. Hi, welcome to the Iowa Files. I am not Bill Sherman, so I know. I shaved, so it's okay. I am so sorry we had a change, a conflict in the schedule, so we will get Mr. Sherman in our next series to talk about one-room schoolhouses. I had somebody ask about seeing Bennett School, which is our one-room schoolhouse that we manage. And I would say, you come to the Iowa Files, you know me, you call me up and say, Gale, I'd like to see Bennett School. I have the key and I know the alarm code. So we can still make that happen. So instead of learning about one-room schoolhouses, today we're going to be talking about the Underground Railroad and the John Brown Freedom Trail. Good. Thank you. Your check is in the mail. I just want to acknowledge David, who is our videographer. He usually comes up and talks a little bit about his business, and he is absolutely fantastic. So he gives us a fantastic break on the videotaping and the live streaming. He does an amazing job with groups to talk about ways to go get past impasses in thinking, creativity. Absolutely fantastic. I also want to thank EMC Insurance Foundation, our members and donors, the Iowa Arts Council, all these folks who help us make the Iowa Files happen. So with minor ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Gale Brubaker is the executive director of the West Des Moines Historical Society. She is charming. She's one of my favorite people. My God, I feel like I've got my fan club here. This is fantastic. For those of you who don't know, we are celebrating 52 years this year in 2022. 2020 was our 50th birthday, but I don't know if you noticed, the whole world kind of went kablooey. So we did not get to celebrate it as adequately as we wanted to. So, but stay tuned because we're going to have a celebration, dang it. So, if you don't know, the West Des Moines Historical Society was formed in 1970 specifically to save the home of James C. Jordan. We are at 2000 Fuller Road, so just down the street a bit. And we are a stop on the Underground Railroad. As you will find out, there were quite a few places that were stops on the Underground Railroad in Iowa, but there aren't a lot of buildings left. So that is an extra reason why this home is critical to Iowa and national history. Our mission statement, we are a volunteer-based organization. Volunteer, I'm going to be hitting you up. We are dedicated to community enrichment through education, preservation, and celebration. So this is what we're doing. We're celebrating West Des Moines' rich history. So the Underground Railroad, what it was, what it wasn't. The Underground Railroad as a concept has been around for centuries. It is still in existence today, as is slavery. It was one of the very first recorded instances I can find is a Quaker neighbor of George Washington's helped a couple of his enslaved individuals reach freedom. Father of our country was quite peeved about this because in his mind, this neighbor was doing nothing more than stealing his property, which legally he was. So it was a network of secret routes and safe houses and individuals who believed in abolition. So these were not just white men and white women like the Jordans. There were free blacks, formerly enslaved people, indigenous people, Mexicans. We'll talk a little bit about that. White abolitionists, they were all part of this fight for freedom. And they all had different reasons for being part of the Underground Railroad. There were some people like John Brown, who we'll meet, and James Jordan, who believed in abolition as a cause, that it was unethical, it was wrong to own another human being. There were some people who were part of the Underground Railroad because of the whole NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. They knew that slavery was not going to be a tenable situation and that their northern cities were going to be flooded with freed African Americans, free Black people. They didn't want them going to their schools, attending their churches. So if they want to get up to Canada, I'll do what I can to help. If they want to go back overseas to Africa, we'll make that happen. So there is a whole scale of what being an abolitionist is. A little bit of information about Iowa and the treatment of Black people. In 1839, when we were still just a territory, the Act to Regulate Blacks and Mulattoes was passed. And I apologize, some of this language occasionally feels very kind of offensive. So we're just being historical. This is the language that was used in these acts and laws. So a Black or a mulatto person had to obtain a court certificate stating that they were free and pay a $500 bond. In 2021, that was equivalent of $14,747. That was a bond to prove that you were legally free and you were going to behave appropriately and correctly while you were in our territory. People who were coming through, enslaved people, could pass through and not be rescued. So Iowa as a territory was not very supportive of the rights of Black people and mulattoes. In 1840 was the first law in the books to prevent these groups from marrying. The law was repealed by 1851, and Iowa was the second state to legalize interracial marriage. It didn't become legal in the whole US until 1967. So Iowa was very much ahead of the curve in that area of equality. 1844, the Constitution prohibits slavery, and this is a constitution that James Jordan helped write, but took away all the rights for Negroes to settle in Iowa. Well, they could settle, they couldn't vote, they couldn't serve in the military, they couldn't be elected to a legislative office. So they really disenfranchised this population. So when we became a state in 1846, in 1851, the exclusion law was passed. This prohibited Negro immigration into Iowa. So here's another part of that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act repercussions. They could stay here, but it was still dangerous for any formerly enslaved person to live in Iowa because the 1850 Act said that slave hunters could come up and grab them and sell them back down south with no repercussions. So that is why what James Jordan and Melinda and Cynthia and all those other folks, the Houstons, made such an impact. They were putting their own lives at risk to help other people. So that's the guy. That's James Jordan. That is a photo. We don't know what the year is. We know it's after 1872 because it has the addition. And then there are those people hanging out. We don't allow that today. So don't think you can come to the Jordan house and hang. You wouldn't want to anyway. It's kind of scary. So he was originally from Virginia. It's a part of the country. It's a state that is now West Virginia. There's a lot of detail into why West Virginia seceded from Virginia. It was much rockier. It was not set up for large-scale plantations as the eastern part of the state was. After the Nat Turner Rebellion, citizens in the western part of Virginia petitioned to have slavery outlawed. The eastern part of the state, a lot more populous, they had a lot more representation, voted that down. So that was just one of the factors that led to West Virginia coming into being. He came to Iowa, what we now know as West Des Moines, in the fall of 1846. If you come visit us at the Jordan House, we will tell you his whole history of how he ping-ponged across the country to get to what we now call home. He was a state legislator. He was very critical in moving the state capital from Iowa City to Des Moines. He served as a Polk County supervisor for 3 terms. He was a businessman. He was friends with the Hubbles and the Saverys and all those people whose names we know. And chief conductor for the Underground Railroad in Walnut Township. So why are we using this terminology, this railroad terminology, to talk about the Underground Railroad? The enslaved people were called passengers or cargo. The whole concept of railroads were incredibly hot at that time. This is when they were also pushing to have the Transcontinental Railroad built. So people were using railroad terms constantly. So if you were trying to keep something secret underground, you would use terminology that would not arise suspicion if somebody overheard you. So you were an agent or a conductor, or it was a station. If I'm talking to you and say, I've got 3 pieces of cargo coming up from Virginia on the next train, somebody hearing that, oh, okay, well, you ordered something from IKEA in Virginia. You and I know, I'm telling you, there are 3 people coming up, so you need to have food ready for them, and the bags with clothing and maybe shoes and bandages. It was a way to talk about an illegal topic openly. So that's why we have this terminology. There are countless routes that people took to reach freedom. In our part of the country, of course, they would go to Canada because it was a lot closer, right? One of the routes that was not known about or hasn't been known about is the route to Texas. And why was it important for these agents, for these freedom seekers? There was a huge financial reward if you could recapture and send an formerly enslaved person back down south to their owner. It seems incredibly sneaky now, but justices were paid a higher fee if they made a legal decision to return a formerly enslaved person than they got if they voted for the enslaved person to stay. So there was tremendous financial reward for judges, sheriffs, all of those people to get formerly enslaved people back. So Underground Railroad routes went north to Canada and then into Mexico. It was a huge destination because if you're in Louisiana or Texas, it's a heck of a lot easier to get over to Mexico, isn't it? And Mexico outlawed slavery significantly earlier than the US did. And in fact, some of the way that they traditionally dealt with people who were formerly enslaved was part of the Catholic religion. If you were an enslaved person and you could get to a Spanish territory and you converted to Catholicism, you would be free. That's what happened in Florida because it was a Spanish territory. Same situation with Mexico. And some of that was a precursor to the Mexican-American War because Texas for a long time was part of a Spanish holding, and they were working under that tradition of if an enslaved person got there and became Catholic, they couldn't be sent back. So that's when slaveholders really started butting heads. So the one thing to remember, the vast majority of freedom seekers self-liberated. People like Harriet Tubman there on the left, where she would go down and rescue people and take them across state lines. Incredibly brave, but no less brave than the other people, such as this gentleman on the right, Henry Bell. He self-liberated, and that photo is allegedly taken at the Jordan House. He settled in Des Moines, became a fantastically respected citizen, he and his wife, and he's buried in Woodland Cemetery. Those folks in the middle are Samuel and Jane Harper. They were part of this last group that John Brown escorted to freedom. This is a photo of them. They settled in Ontario, Canada for the rest of their lives, raised a family. A journalist actually went up and interviewed them and discovered the story that their former owner came up and begged them to come back down to Missouri and work for him after the Civil War and promised he'd treat them a whole lot better this time. Yeah. I believe the phrase that was given was, "I didn't know you were that damn of a fool." So that very strong feeling. So these are people who had this opportunity and they took it. And their bravery is to be just as celebrated as the bravery of people like Harriet Tubman, who kept going back and rescuing hundreds of people. So we are part of the John Brown Freedom Trail. John Brown, radical abolitionist. He was an action abolitionist. There were a lot of people talking about abolition. John Brown was sick and tired of people talking. He wanted action. And he is a fantastic example of one person's hero is another person's terrorist. There are people who have come to the Jordan House when I ask about John Brown, say, "Oh, that murdering thief." Well, technically, sure, he was a murdering thief. Was he doing it for the right reason? I think so, but I'm not allowed to have an opinion. He was radical. He not only believed in the equality of people, he believed that women were equal in intellect and ability to men and deserved to have the vote immediately. So that was just kind of proof. So as part of the John Brown Freedom Trail, if you want to look more into this, I've got a lot of this information from the iowaculture.gov blog, which has a map of the John Brown Freedom Trail and every stop. So we're going to kind of go through what was happening. So December 19th, 1858, John Brown, who was kind of in this area, received news that an enslaved man knew that his family was going to be sold. John Brown was in this area because he was starting the initial plans with financial backers for the raid on Harper's Ferry. And you know what it's like when you're trying to keep a secret? If more than one person knows it, everybody's going to know it. So his backers told John Brown he needed to get away from the eastern part of the United States and do something to get some press. Well, here's this opportunity. John Brown would normally not bother with one or two families. It was a tremendous risk. So why not risk it for 100 people as opposed to 10? But here was this great opportunity to make this fuss, have the press follow him, get some attention and some heat off of the Harper's Ferry planning. So December 20th, 1858, John Brown and 10 men, a couple of his sons were involved, raided 2 farms, rescued 12 women and children. One of the slaveholders was killed during this rescue. It was either cold-blooded murder or self-defense. Depends, again, on which side of the sword you were on. Or from what I've heard, it was a bayonet. So that was on December 20th, so they rested for several weeks because one of the women that they rescued was pregnant and gave birth before they started their trip across the state of Iowa. She named the baby John Brown, which is kind of cool. So February 4th, 1859, that's when they actually crossed the border and got into Iowa. They stayed in Civil Bend with Dr. Ira Blanchard. It's in Fremont County. There's really nothing there anymore to see. So the next stop was Tabor. There is something at Tabor. They stayed at the Reverend Todd house, and John Brown and Reverend Todd were old friends from way back. John Brown was able to store a significant number of munitions at the Todd house during the Bleeding Kansas fighting. So it was well known that that was a stop for John Brown. So the next stop, they went up to the Malvern area. So there's a modern map that shows you how far they had to travel. They did have wagons and horses. They weren't just walking, but they were being chased by sheriffs and slave hunters and journalists. And we all know journalists are the worst of that group, right? There was a tremendous reward on John Brown's head. So they were traveling primarily at night to not get caught. So they got to the Malvern area. They stayed with Charles and Sylvia Tolles. There is nothing, again, left of that location. That is Charles Tolles with a grandchild in the early 1900s. The next stop, and this was significantly farther, I've heard it pronounced Lewes or Lewis. So does anybody have any insight on the Krenek? Lewis? I knew you would know. So, so they went to Lewis next, and that is still a location that is open if you want to do an Underground Railroad road trip. That's in Cass County. That is Reverend George Hitchcock there. And that house has been saved. So that was on February 13th, 1859. The next day, Grove City. This David Barnett was actually a relative of some of the other people that are part of the Underground Railroad, the John Brown Freedom Trail. And unfortunately, their farm has totally disappeared. There was a marker in the middle of a field. So this one of the reasons why the Jordan House, it's so amazing to still have this. The next stop was the Porter Hotel in Dalmanutha. That is just north of Casey. I have been there. There is a cemetery where some of these folks are buried, where John Porter is buried. The story I have heard, I haven't read proof of it, that John Porter had the hotel and the stage there, and he let the freedom seekers stay in the hotel rather than in the barn. And that was incredibly shocking for a lot of people, that he didn't relegate them to sleeping in a field, but gave them actual beds. The next stop was the Jonathan Murray Farm. That's right near Redfield. So unfortunately, again, the house, the land is private. So it is the marker is on the Redfield Depot. But that gives you an idea again. They're able to go anywhere from 14 to 50 miles a day, solely dependent on weather. So then, the Jordan House. That was a pretty long trip. And again, while this is Google Maps showing the roads, were there roads in 1859? No, this was a long, terrifying, exhausting slog for a lot of these folks. So they stayed in the timber that is just up the hill from the Jordan House. They did not stay in the house, and that's one of those popular misconceptions that we talk to people about. It would have been nearly suicidal for both the enslaved people and John Brown and James Jordan to stay in the basement of the house. This was in the middle of nowhere. There were no neighbors around to see this group of 13 people in the area. Did they come up to the house for, again, those bags we talked about with food and clothing? I mean, one woman has a 2-month-old baby. There's going to need to be diapers and things like that. Sure, they came to the house to get that, but it would have been so much safer for them to stay in the wagons at the top of the hill where they could see the sheriff or the slave hunters coming. There are no hidden doors or hiding places in the Jordan House. We have looked because we want to find gold coins, but we have not found any. So while they stayed there, John Brown went into Des Moines and met with John Teasdale, who was also a very well-known abolitionist. And the story is they met in the middle of the Court Avenue Bridge. That way, if somebody came to catch them, they each had an escape route to each end or over the side of the bridge into the river, so they wouldn't be recaptured. The next stop, Brian Holly's farm in Yellowbanks. We don't know much about him, just that he was part of this John Brown Freedom Trail. So that's the day after they were at the Jordan House. The next stop, Cornwell Dickinson Farm. They made 50 miles that day. So obviously the weather was very mild. It was much easier for the horses to draw the wagons, and I imagine they were walking too. So that was one of the longest days that they traveled. J.B. Grinnell, we all know who he is. They stayed 2 days with the Grinnells. That is the home. It unfortunately has been destroyed as well. So he met with Mr. Grinnell, who was also a compatriot of James Jordan. They had a lot of similar beliefs, not just abolition, but both very, very anti-alcohol. J.B. Grinnell had housing for his workers, that one of the contingencies for being able to live in company housing is that you would never bring a drop of alcohol in there. And if you did, you were out. James Jordan was also very much anti-alcohol, a teetotaler. So J.B. Grinnell and John Brown sat down and started working out those final details for the raid on Harper's Ferry. The next stop, Draper Reynolds Farm, about 42 miles, so the weather was still good. That gets us to February 23rd, so they have been traveling now for about 2 weeks. Then they went through Iowa City. They went on the way going to Springdale, where they spent most of their time. They met with Dr. Bowen and Mr. Clark, and in fact, Dr. Bowen had to hide John Brown because there were very angry townspeople who were appalled at what they had heard about John Brown's men slaughtering that slave owner, and they were tired of this sort of violence coming to their communities. So he was able to shelter him so John Brown could get away and get to Springdale. They spent 2 weeks there, and John Brown was really familiar with Springdale because that's where he and his men practiced the raid on Harper's Ferry. So they had guns there, they had the people there. So they ran through all of those contingency plans. What could happen on this raid on a federal armory? Because that's not going to be easy. So after that, they went to West Liberty. They spent 2 weeks there getting the transportation together. So Mr. Pinkerton of the Pinkerton Detective Agency was able to make arrangements and get a boxcar put right behind the engine of a train that was going to Chicago. And from what the newspaper article said, it was very well known in the community that this group of freedom seekers was hiding on the farm. And in fact, a lot of the town turned out that day to watch them be loaded onto the boxcar. It was almost like a picnic because it was just so amazing that this group of 13 people and John Brown and the other folks were getting on this boxcar. So after that, they crossed the Mississippi River. They went through Davenport, Chicago, Detroit, took a ferry over from Detroit and went into Windsor, Ontario, where they were supported in a large part by the Canadian government. The Canadian government had schools and job training programs, sometimes controversial. Some people didn't think that was appropriate to do that for these, Americans that were coming over. But it was a lifesaver for a lot of them, including the Harpers, whose picture we saw earlier. So 7 months later was that disastrous raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown was captured. Quite a few of his men were killed, including some of the Iowans that were with him, and he was hanged 2 months later. That's a very famous painting of him kissing a small child on the way to the gallows. Some say John Brown was destined to be a martyr. This was important to him. He thought this was the way to get people fired up, to stop talking about abolition and doing something about it. And he's right. The song, John Brown's Body Lies Moldering in the Grave, became I don't think they had top 40 then, but it was really popular, especially amongst soldiers, and was sung a lot. And it really inspired people that this man was willing to sacrifice himself for this cause. So, how can you get involved with us? We have open house tours every Friday and Sunday at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. You can reserve your tickets online at WDMHS.org. Volunteer for a committee or a project like gardening. Yard work, gardening, special events. We decorate for the holidays. We have education committees and marketing committees. We'd love to have your input. Become a member. Our members help us get things done, like Iowa Files at no charge. We're getting ready to put in our final order for the Pathway to History for 2022. It's an engraved brick pathway that is right outside the Jordan House. So you can cement your name, your place in history. Donate. We have donation envelopes back there. We have a plexiglass box you can throw a couple dollars in. Or if you're young and savvy, you can text WDMHS to 44321. It works. I've checked it, and I'm neither young nor savvy. So thank you for joining us today, and I would love to answer any questions that you have. Yes, ma'am.
How do they coordinate? I mean, when the postal system is still fairly primitive, Tony Express kind of stuff, so, I mean, how do they keep these messages to each other to make these connections? When there's something that,
It was kind of handy that James Jordan had so many acres. You know, he had almost 1,200 acres. So he had a lot of people going to and fro to take care of his cattle. So it's not suspicious if he's going down to southwest Iowa, which was part of the land that he owned, that he or his sons who were in on this and the wives would stop in at one of the locations at the Hitchcock house and pass information that way. It really helped that he was a really integral part of politics and business at this time as well. He was one of the movers and shakers, so they could have these private meetings. And the governor at the time was very much into abolition as well. So it was a little slower, but they were able to communicate. And my opinion, they were probably in this constant state of readiness. From what I've heard, that was one of the real roles that the women played, that they would get together every couple of weeks and put together these, for lack of a better word, care packages. So you would knit a shawl and have socks and things like that ready to go. So if somebody showed up, you could grab it and get it to them and they could get going. So it would be kind of stressful too, because you would never know when somebody is going to show up. One of the Jordan sons wrote in a autobiography that he remembers seeing little African-American children hiding in the barn, and they all knew this was mom and dad's secret and don't tell. So, yes.
I have a question. I mean, I know nothing about the trial of John Brown, etc. But was it clear during the course of the investigation, was there anything I mean, Harper's Ferry was a federal relations, I imagine it was considered a federal crime.
Yes. Yes.
Did any of the people in Iowa, were they any possible co-conspirators, or were they investigated, or was there any nervousness about, I guess it was the FBI or whatever.
No, how far did that kind of investigation reach? You know what, I can't answer that, but I know that the governor and a lot of northern politicians at the time were quite vocal in their support for John Brown. The cynic in me says it was never going to be successful. There was absolutely no way for this small group of men to go down and try to raid a federal armory and arm slaves. It just wasn't going to happen. And I think he knew it. You know, we have some stories that we can't really share on the tour about John Brown's being at the Jordan house one time, and the sheriff showed up, or the sheriff was trying to get a posse together, and the Jordan kids were in town, heard this was happening, got back to the farm, warned their dad, and John Brown was ready to be a martyr. He thought this was going to be his opportunity to stand on the porch and speak to these people and show them the error of their ways. James Jordan wasn't real thrilled with that. So family legend goes that after trying to convince John Brown what a bad idea this was, James Jordan pulled out his pistol, whacked John Brown over the head, tied him up, and had the boys hide him in the back 40 in the middle of the cornfield. So when the sheriff showed up, search the basement, search the attic. I don't have John Brown hidden in my house, which was true. So I think that says something about his mentality. And, you know, there were a lot of repercussions that came from that raid, of people captured, people wounded who died later. But I don't think there was ever, I don't know if there was ever any coordinated national attempt to find the rest of the conspirators. They just didn't have that kind of mechanism either. Anybody else?
Did I read somewhere that they bought some other land?
They bought some other land. The Jordans?
Yeah, the Jordans actually owned.
Oh, the West Des Moines Historical Society. Yes. 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 Yes, it is 3 acres that is just west of the Jordan House. We were able to work, this was a multi-year project, and through the fantastic support of the city of West Des Moines, we were able to buy 3 acres of that campground that's for sale. So we're not quite ready to announce our plans, but we're really excited.
So can you guys get rid of some of that church campground building?
The awful buildings, that is the dream.
Restore this back to what it was.
We would absolutely love to do that. We would love to do restored Oak Savannah, which is, and increase the stability and the cleanliness of the watershed. But let's be honest, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's why we need members and donors and supporters, because projects of that size are fantastic to think about, but really expensive. So
I would have liked to have seen a lot of those rooms in the upper house that you guys are using as offices.
yeah.
You know, move you out and restore them to the.
Well, we only have one room that we're using as an office. So my coworker and I sit about 2 feet apart. So
But isn't there other parts that are closed?
there are a couple closets that
Oh, I
are
thought there was
used.
a hallway
No,
and that.
no, we've got 16 rooms that we want to show off, including brand new exhibits. So if you haven't been there in a few years, we've put up quite a few new exhibits since 2019. So the first one was West Des Moines at War. So we talk about the history of being a soldier, being a support at home. We have our Valley Junction room that is all about medical care, and the Vandenberg Pharmacy. We right now have a quilt exhibit up. So there are over 50 quilted items that were done by the amazingly talented people of the Des Moines Area Quilters Guild all over the house. So
That's up there now.
yes, it will be up there till middle of June. And we're actually going to be having an auction to raise money for a new project that we're going to be announcing as well.
So are you gonna have any more of those luncheons like I went to?
We're not sure. That
It
again,
was so nice.
it was really nice. And you know what helps with that? Volunteers. See how it all ties back in? Yes, things like that happen. We have a small board of directors. We have 1 1/4 staff. And I'm pretty awesome, but I can't do everything. So that is why we love our volunteers. I've got a lady there who's knitting, who is our primary gardening volunteer, because all the things I can do, grow things, is not one of them. So she's working with a couple other ladies, and we're going to try to we're going to focus on a few vegetables, but primarily herbs, especially those with medicinal and cooking, so we can do some education about those.
I'd like to see them get rid of all that stuff.
I would too.
When I went to San Antonio, have you ever seen the Alamo?
Yeah.
And here's this fantastic
Yeah.
place, and all around it are big buildings.
Yeah.
Insurance buildings. And you're-
It's right in the middle of,
Is it
yes.
right there? I mean, it's way to all the ambiance.
Yeah, we would absolutely love that, because this is the last part of old West Des Moines that is still in existence. Think of what those trees have seen, the history, not just obviously James Jordan, but the indigenous people who were there before. There's a lot of rich history. So if there's anybody out there with an extra $200,000, my name is Gale Brubaker, and you can call me anytime. So it's one of those things that would absolutely be fantastic. And we would love to have dinners and events and things like that. So, but if you've been to the Jordan House, you realize the rooms are pretty small. And with COVID, we were closed for 3 months, and we have to limit the number of people still that are in the house. So as people are getting vaccinated and it's opening up, we're welcoming more people. But things like lunches and tea parties are a blast, but they are very labor intensive. So we just help us be as awesome as I know you want us to be. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your patience today. I know I'm not good about one-room schoolhouses, but again, if anybody wants to come see the Bennett School, which is the other museum we manage, you're my friends, you give me a call, I'll open it up and you can come see it. Well, we've got one more for this year. And then that is May 15th, all about Riverview Park. And then the next series will start next September through May. So I've got a few things planned already, but I don't have it completely firmed up. August, I would say August. I've got to work with Daryl because we're just so incredibly grateful that the library lets us be here. And the Friends Foundation is one of the reasons why we can do live streaming. So they're a fantastic supporter of us. And it's a great partnership. And we want to continue that. But again, $200,000 and those buildings will go. All right. Thank you so much and have a good day.